Well, welcome everyone to tonight's event in Kai Theater, albeit virtually. My name is Mariska Jung, and I will be the moderator of tonight's event. And it promises to be very exciting, so it's my great honor and pleasure to introduce you to our program of today. Today is the second part of a trilogy around justice in a multi-species world, which is organized by VUB Crosstalks, which is part of the Vrije Universiteit here in Brussels, as well as Kai Theater. And this trilogy is part of a larger series called More Than Human Encounters, which stretches over a period from last January until March, April. And you can find all the new events that we will be organizing around this theme on the website of Kai Theater and the VUB Crosstalks. So this series seeks to explore the conditions, the challenges, the possibilities of coexistence in a world that consists of humans and more than human entities, while that world is at the same time heavily impacted by human interventions and human institutions such as capitalism, patriarchy, and climate change. And so tonight we are going to build on the conversation we had with Professor Manisha Dekka during the first part of this trilogy, which was about theorizing ways to overcome anthropocentrism in Western legal orders to arrive at justice for animals, or better put, for more than human, for non-human animals. And we are going to grapple with some of the questions that talk left us with, such as should we confer fundamental rights to more than human entities, such as rivers or seas, dunes, rainforests, mountains? What can we learn from alliances between humans and non-human entities in their resistance against violence? And how is the struggle for decolonization related to struggles for livelihood, for survival, and for autonomy by and for non-human animals? So those of you who have been there during the first part may wonder, where is Olaf? Olaf Nuwanje is the curator of this trilogy, and she would usually also be the moderator of today's event. Unfortunately, she fell ill and is awaiting the results of a COVID-19 test. Therefore, she cannot join us tonight, for which we are all very sorry, because she put so much work in organizing this, preparing the conversations with the speakers of tonight. And yeah, I hope she's watching. I assume she's watching. So Olaf, I just want to extend to you many get well wishes from all of us here. And we hope to see you soon with the third part, which is going to be tomorrow. So I don't think we're going to see you soon. Well, we'll talk about that later, I guess. So this also meant that I was asked quite last minute, namely yesterday afternoon, to fall in as to substitute as a moderator. And this means, while I have a lot of confidence in both the speakers as well as everyone behind the scene, it may mean that some things don't go as smoothly as they could. So I ask of you, the audience, for some compassion and understanding that we have to make do with the circumstances that we find ourselves in today. But then let's turn to the program of tonight, because we have two magnificent speakers. I'm not sure if you see them because I constantly keep turning to my right, but you will see them maybe in a minute. So first of all, we will start with a talk of more or less 10 minutes by Eva Bernard Kempers. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Antwerp here in Belgium, and she will introduce us to her principle of animal dignity. Thereafter, we will watch a video of more or less 10 minutes again that is titled Voices of the Dunes, which is made by Darko Lacunas. And Darko Lacunas is then also our third speaker of tonight, who is an urban sociologist and action researcher. And he will introduce us to how he has come to do these types of projects and how he connects these to decolonial and indigenous criticism of Western knowledge systems. And we will close off the event with quite a long roundtable conversation, which is where you will come in as the audience as well. We will be sitting there. We'll have both the speakers, both Eva and Darko, and we will have the Zoom chats. So please, during all the interventions already now, while I'm talking, you can type in your comments, type in your questions. I can imagine that you may also will type in, please, Mariska, speak a little bit slower. I will try to remember that, but you can also type that in. And yeah, just continue to share with us your thoughts. Even though we're in the same space, we really want this to be a collective conversation. And so during that roundtable conversation, They will talk with each other, the speakers. I will ask some questions, and then I will read out some questions and comments that you have written in the chats. So for the first part, I'd like to invite Eva Bernard-Kempers to the stage. She is a PhD candidate, as I said, at the University of Antwerp, under the auspices of the Animal and Law Chair. And she has a background in cultural anthropology, green criminology, and environmental law. So please, Eva, join us.
So thank you, Mariska, for this introduction. And I'm very happy to be here tonight with you. So before we start the roundtable, I will give you a short introduction in the theme of my research. And because we are speaking in the context of multi-species justice, I will especially reflect on the question what the place of animals could be in a more than human legality. So most arguments for the improvement for animals' legal status start from the assumption that the legal realm is a dichotomy. On the one hand, you have persons, which can be humans and companies. On the other hand, you have things, which are entirely defined by their position as objects, as object of property rights. The relationship between these two is perceived as a relationship of domination, an instrumental relationship. And since animals are still regarded as property, the envisioned way forward is to move them to the other side, to recognize them as persons of law. So animal advocates, such as, for instance, Stephen Weiss, with his Non-Human Rights Project, they try to argue that animals, elephants, chimpanzees, they are so much like humans. They have so much capacities in common with humans that we should see them as persons and not as things. So for the ones of you who listened to Manisha's lecture 2 weeks ago, you might know already that there are also some problems associated with this approach, with this aim. Because the concept of the person is very much rooted in this specific idea, this disembodied rational entity, which might not be a perfect fit for animals. So I think this is especially the case when we look at this issue from the perspective of multi-species justice. Because as you might be aware, the concept of multi-species justice concerns the question what happens to the practice and concept of justice when it moves beyond the human to encompass a broader range of the more than human and their relationships. So one of the main implications is that we need to recast any conception of the individual as constituted within interspecies relationships. Moreover, it also entails employing a very critical perspective on justice that does not begin and end with the Western liberal subject of rights. So this lens of multi-species justice demands us to rethink some of the common assumptions based in these notions, but also requires a different way of doing politics by including voices of those previously unheard, such as the dunes, for instance, and animals. So if we then go back to the question of animal and the law, I think that from the perspective of multi-species justice, we can wonder whether merely broadening the scope of entities that count as person is enough. Instead, we might need to look for other ways to reshape law in a way that it can accommodate for these different modes of being and different modes of agency in the world without requiring those non-humans to have their intelligence or their sentience in common with the human. So in short, I think from the perspective of multi-species justice, we need to move the attention away from the central anthropos towards the broader web of relations that constitutes life. So one of the things I do in my research is I take these theoretical ideas and this framework, and I look at the actual positive law legislation of continental European countries to see to what extent I see traces of such theories already today in the legal realm. And of course, the image that I then encounter is very imperfect because, as you all might be aware, animals are only superficially protected, in many cases only insofar as the protection aligns with human interest. Nevertheless, I also see various very interesting developments that might turn us in the direction of a more than human legality already. So to give some short examples, first of all, we see in a growing number of jurisdictions that a separate category is created for animals. in the civil code. So this is a development that has been happening over the last 10 to 15 years. And now it is the case in France, in Germany, in the Netherlands, Switzerland, Austria, and also in the new book on property law in Belgium, which will go into force in September. Animals are now separately defined as sentient beings. They are no longer just things, only things. So even though these provisions often state that those articles applying to things still apply to animals in most cases, I do see this as a remarkable development, as it really makes the animal more visible to law. So again, remembering the lecture of Manisha Deka and her concept of legal beingness as a way to accommodate the being of animals in common law, we might see this new civil code category as a kind of continental civil law version, a little first step in the direction of legal beingness in a continental context. So another central aspect in my research is the concept of animal dignity as a possible guideline to codify the intrinsic legal relevance of animals for law. And this concept of animal dignity now appears also more often in legislation. In Switzerland, it stood very central already for a long time, but also in the region of Brussels and in Luxembourg, it stands very central. The UNCAP, the proposed Convention for Animal Health and Protection, also mentioned animal dignity as an important principle. And since it goes beyond pathocentrism, it takes more than only suffering of animals into account. I think that this is a possible way to facilitate law and move the attention to the flourishing of all different beings in relation to each other and to their environment. So lastly, we see more often that animal protection organizations can acquire access to courts on behalf of animals. So they can represent animal interests and animals in court. For instance, in France, they can now be civil parties to criminal suits against animal abusers. This means that in practice, they are exercising those rights that victims would usually be able to exercise. Such organizations then also sometimes can receive compensation on behalf of the animal, the wounded animal or the hurt animal. So we should always, of course, look at such representation critically because it's still clearly humans representing animals, not letting animals speak for themselves in a way. But in the current conditions, I think this kind of representation is at least better than having no representation at all. Apart from that, it also really challenges this dichotomy between the person and the thing, because the harm to animals is regarded as legally relevant in itself. So the message I'd like to end this introduction with is quite a hopeful one, because we still undeniably have a very, very anthropocentric legal system and legal order. But law is not a static institution. It is constantly changing and it is very dynamic. So I think we should stay in touch with these developments that are happening right now and try to shape them, to form them in such a way that they can contribute to a multi-species just society. Okay, thanks. Then I now give the floor to the Junes.
Thank you so much, Eva, for sharing with us your thoughts and a short introduction to your research, which sounds very relevant to indeed also what we've been discussing in the first part. So now we're going to watch a 10-minute video. It's called Voices of the Junes. It's made by one of the speakers today, Darko Lagunas, and he will speak after.
Denk je dat duinen ons iets willen vertellen überhaupt? Is er iets om naar te luisteren?
Nou ja, luisteren en observeren wat je ziet gebeuren met die duinen. En ze vertellen zeker een verhaal. Ze vertellen een verhaal van onder wat voor invloed zij zijn en waar ze vandaan komen en waar ze naartoe gaan. Ja, dat is een kwestie van goed kijken naar die duinen, wat ze doen. En doordat wij dus constant te veel mineraal in de lucht gooien, waardoor die regen zo mineraalrijk wordt, krijg je dus een heel ander soort duin. Zijn eigen eigenschap is altijd dat hij veel schraler was. En nu wordt hij rijk met allerlei stoffen, waardoor er heel veel planten op gaan groeien.
Dus een duin vertelt eigenlijk door te doen.
En wees reageert hij op ons handelen. Ja. Niet alleen de duin, het bos vertelt ook dat soort dingen. Dus met zijn eigen manier dan wel.
Zijn er ook plekken waar jij ziet dat de duinen in opstand komen? Of herken jij vormen van verzet?
Of ze in verzet komen. Nou, ik heb het idee dat ze zoiets van... ze hebben wel een lange adem. Het verzet is niet dat ze dus in een uur ineens een protestactie beginnen of zoiets. Maar zij zullen er zo rustig aan een paar jaar over doen. En dan komen ze toch met z'n allen aanrollen. Hè? Zoiets. Ze hebben de tijd, hè. Ik bedoel, ze hebben geen tijd, laat ik het zo zeggen. Ze hebben geen tijd, dus die speelt geen rol.
Ze hebben geen tijd.
Nee, dat gaat... enkele wezen zijn ze tijdloos.
Waarom zijn ze tijdloos?
Ja, omdat ze nooit een afspraak maken. Ze maken nooit een afspraak. Zo van, we gaan over 3 jaar liggen we hier. Er wordt helemaal niet in tijd gerekend.
Ja, ze gaan natuurlijk ook niet dood. Er is geen
Nee,
leeftijd.
ze hebben ook geen leeftijd. Nee, zij zijn... ooit hebben ze minder in de aarde gezeten. Waren ze lava, kwamen ze naar buiten en dan waren ze rots. En ging de regen en de winter aan het spel. En toen gingen ze met de rivier mee naar beneden en dan liggen ze hier. En over zoveel tijd zakken ze in de aarde weer of zoiets en ze worden weer vloeistof. En kijk, een vogel kan je ringen, hè, om tekker opzetten, zo'n volgding. Je zou natuurlijk op een zandkorrel een volgding moeten zetten. Kijken waar die allemaal geweest is en waar die naartoe gaat bedoel. En dan wel op een heel lang termijn, hè. Wij kijken natuurlijk ook naar een bepaald moment. En dat is ons moment wat wij weten van onze grootouders naar onze kleinkinders. Dat is een periode wat we een beetje belangrijk vinden. En zo'n duin heeft dat natuurlijk niet. Ik weet niet of daar korrels liggen die de een zegt ouder is dan de ander of zoiets. Ik weet het niet. Generatiekloven tussen zandkorrels. Weet je hebt wel de jonge duinen en de oude duinen. Hè? Dat die oude duinen dus veel trager zijn. De jonge duinen veel dynamieker. Die moeten nog als zoiets, heb je het idee, of zoiets, maar die veranderen in onze leventijd al zichtbaar. Oude duinen die zijn een paar honderd jaar oud, dat gaat veel trager, dat veranderen. Dat zijn ook vaak wat lager en glooiender. Allemaal begroeid wel. Met als er een stuifgat in komt, dan is dat heel slow. Het zijn eigenlijk soort bejaarden, ja. En ook de kleuren zijn ook anders. Hè? Gradatie van kleuren is allemaal wat. Ze zeggen ook grijze duinen. Die oude duinen zijn vaak grijze duinen. Het is minder contrastrijk, omdat ze soms wel mooie kleine bloemen kunnen hebben.
Zou het kunnen dat er dan kalk uit is getrokken door het land? Of,
Ja, er is wel wat kalk uit. Ja, dat klopt wel. Dat kunnen wat zuurder zijn. De regen neemt ook kalk mee naar beneden. Hè? Dat zakt naar beneden. Maar als er natuurlijk zo'n duin weer helemaal ondersteboven komt, komt die kalk weer mee naar boven ook. Hè? Dat blijft nog een beetje heen en weer gaan. Maar als dat al jaren blijft liggen en het verandert niet meer, dan is die bovenlaag ontkalkt. Dan krijg je mosgroei en zo. En dan is het veel zuurdere grond aan het worden. Dus hoe ouder, hoe zuurder. Dat heb je soms mensen ook. Hè?
Zie jij duinen als golvende beweging?
Ja, zie ik wel als een beweging. En daar kijk je nu naar. Maar, bijna zie ik ze aankomen. Het ligt nu stil, maar op mijn gevoel zit er toch een soort voortgang in. Een verandering. Wat me wel aanspreekt.
Als je die duin pakt waar die boom op staat bijvoorbeeld, wat...
Ja, dat is natuurlijk een door mensenhand gecreëerde toestand. Want dit was eerst bos, hè. Hier. Dus hebben ze allemaal die boom stond midden in het bos.
Oké.
Dan hebben ze eentje laten staan. En die is nu aan doodgaan. Maar ja, die zie je dus dat duin zelf, dat was helemaal begroeid ook nog. En het wordt steeds witter. Dus daar gaat straks ook de wind meer langs schuren. Dan gaat dat heel ander spel worden. Ja, er is ook veel meer verrassing in die duinen, denk ik. Dat je verrast wordt als je in dat landschap loopt. Omdat als je teruggaat en naar huis en je komt een paar dagen later terug. Ondertussen hebben ze even met z'n miljoenen, zijn ze even verplaatst een stukje verder. En dan verrekt, zeg, dat hebben ze toch mooi gedaan. Dat gewoon toch een soort avontuur zit er ook in het duingebied. Ik denk, ja, een duinlandschap is echt ook wel iets heel zichtbaar is dat de aarde niet stabiel is. Of dat het landschap niet stabiel is. Dat het in ontwikkeling is altijd. En wij als mensen hebben graag dat het stabiel is. Omdat we daar onze economie op drijft. Dat we dan weten waar we aan toe zijn. Noem maar op. En zo'n duingebied heeft geen plan. En dat is wel jammer. Want ja, daar kunnen we niet op reageren dan of zoiets. Hè. Dat vinden we lastig. En dat, hier in Staatsbosbeheer ook. Dan hebben ze een fietspad aangelegd en dan gaat die duin daar overheen. Ja, dan hadden ze dat fietspad liever ergens anders willen leggen. Maar ja, toen hadden ze nog niet door dat die duin eraan kwam. Ik denk dat een duin dat een beetje vertelt ook wel. Dat je niet te veel van tevoren alles moet willen regelen. Dat je ook wat moet inspelen op momenten en niet constant de leiding wil hebben. Een mens wil een bepaalde manier de natuur beheersen. Dat je daar meer onderdeel van bent. En, niet altijd zo dwingend moet zijn.
Dus die duinen die zijn niet zozeer in strijd met het water?
Ik denk het niet. Nee, dat gevoel heb ik ook niet. Zij schuiven gewoon mee naar binnen toe. Of ze nemen de zee, wordt meegenomen en komen weer terug. Dat is heel anders dan bij de polder of de stormvloedkering. Dat is gewoon warm zo en dat kan niet. Het moet anders. Er is niet zo dat die kering heeft wieletjes van onder dat we hem naar achter kunnen zetten of iets dergelijks. Die staat gewoon vast, dus op die plek. En die is zo vreemd geconstrueerd dat die, als het water te hoog gaat worden, functioneert hij niet meer. En als het water te laag wordt, ook niet meer. Dus die moet alleen maar in deze momentopname van het klimaat, werkt die. En gaat het klimaat een beetje anders doen, ja, dan is hij verloren. Maar als het klimaat iets anders gaat doen en de duinen die gaan niet verloren, die schuiven op. En daarom was in die tijd ook altijd die zeereep moest zo aangeplant worden. Want de rode lijn die Rijkswaterstaat heeft getrokken langs Nederland, daar moeten we vasthouden. Maar die rode lijn is niet daar heeft de duinlijn niks mee te maken. Die kunnen net zo goed naar voren of naar achter gaan.
Kan die duin eigenlijk niet zoveel schelen wat er gebeurt?
Nee, die rode lijn in ieder geval zeker niet. Nee. Maar ze passen zich in het klimaat aan eigenlijk. En dat is natuurlijk die strijd die wij dan strijd tegen het water noemen. Is begonnen natuurlijk toen we zeiden van rond 1100, toen de zeespiegel steeg een beetje. En die inhammen groter werden. Ja, toen wouden we blijven wonen hier. En normaal, als we ons gewoon net als dieren aan zouden passen aan de omgeving, dan zouden we al lang naar het oosten zijn vertrokken. En toen hebben we ons denkvermogen zo gebruikt om die dijken te bouwen die steeds groter worden. Maar we kunnen het niet overzien, dus er gebeuren verrassende dingen dan in het klimaat. En dan moeten we daar weer voor ons gevoel dan oplossingen voor te zorgen, omdat we deze situatie willen vasthouden.
Hello. Yes, my name is Darko Lagunas, and the person you were just listening to was Marinus van Dijken. And I want to start off with a little bit of information about Marinus, because he's not just a dune dweller, as I introduced him, but the project that we were doing is about giving a voice to different entities in the Zeeland, the delta of the Netherlands. And we were searching for the indigenous voice. And how do you do that in a far industrialized country? It's quite a challenge to see, okay, what is it then, that indigenous knowledge? But I think through coincidence, we got to know Marinus van Dijken. He is an artist, and he has been living in Schouwen-Duiveland, the area that you've been watching, for his whole life. And he has been playing with the dunes since he was a little child. And now he is quite older. he is making arts. He's studying the dunes. He has his art space in the middle of the dunes. And every day he takes walks. Every weekend he goes to the dunes and does his research. So he has this really embodied knowledge and not only knowledge, but also feeling about how to feel the dunes, how to move through the dunes, and how to interpret them to some extent. And I would say that that comes very close to what I saw in another research in Ecuador, Bolivia, and Chile on indigenous knowledge about sustainability. And so Marinus van Dijken in Zeeland, his type of knowing, feeling comes very close to almost indigenous elder knowledge, I would say. Giving a voice to the dunes, you can't only do that through science. I think Eva already said something about it, that it's not only about the typical Western scientific knowing, but also about feeling, feeling the dunes, and in order to understand movements. So giving a voice to the dunes and also to other entities in Zealand, we interviewed him. And yeah, that I had to say that about Marinus, because this is a very special person. It was part of a bigger research that is ongoing. The Embassy of the North Sea is an organization who wants to give rights to nature, rights to the North Sea, at least along the coast of the Netherlands. I'm part of the case study that focuses on the delta. So there are 3 case studies, one on the delta, one on the movement of the eel, and the other is focusing on underwater noise. Yeah, just to go a little bit back for the question, why did the Embassy of the North Sea ask me to do that research, is because I did research on the perspective of indigenous peoples, communities in Ecuador, Bolivia, and Chile on sustainability. And sustainability, when looking at it from the global south, but especially from indigenous communities far up in the Amazon or other places, you see that sustainability is actually a very Western, typical conceptual, scientific, bureaucratic idea. Maybe we can go further into that later. The perspectives from indigenous people really open up your eyes when looking at it from that perspective. And the Embassy of the North Sea, they wanted to have this perspective, this non-Western perspective, also in the case of doing research in the Netherlands for this project. So I'm a urban sociologist. I focus on the nature-culture divisions, dualisms, on the human relation to nature. As a urban sociologist, that is not the most usual subject to choose. Yeah, through my interest, this is where I'm at. Yeah, the research, to finish off, the research of the Embassy of the North Sea in Zeeland gave rise to a new question that I want to put it up here to discussion. And that is the question, is representation enough? Because when looking at when giving a voice to the dunes, to the sea, or to the harbor porpoise, which is a small dolphin swimming in the waters in Zealand. You start searching like, okay, how do I interpret the voice or the different things that you hear when speaking to, for example, to Marinus. And you start noticing that you're imposing, to some extent, interpretations, which are, of course, human interpretations. And when talking about rights of nature again, are we not reproducing these differences, imposing a human structure on the natural world, which cannot be put in a box? It's way more complex than that. So maybe we should go further than just representation. And how can we get there? I wanted to throw that in, and hopefully we can start some discussion about that.
Darko, for your explanation of why you made the movie and your own interests into that. I'm also very intrigued in how you conceptualize indigeneity. So for sure we can talk about that further as well. And also the question about representation is very much related to what we actually also discussed a bit last week with Manisha Dekka. To what extent can we arrive at justice through Western legal orders, which are inevitably anthropocentric? So now we've arrived at the final part of today, which is also the longest part of today, which is the roundtable conversation. So we will have a conversation with Eva, with Darko, unfortunately not directly with the dunes, but we can definitely reflect on natural formations and how they can be represented or should be represented in our legal orders. And I am already looking at the chat, and I see 2 questions already by Peter Jens and Herman Kroe, if I pronounce it correctly, and 1 comment by Anne Alifuru, which says, thank you, Eva and Darko. So I would like to encourage you to just put up your comments, your questions, your thoughts, even if they are unfinished, because we really like to stimulate a conversation as much as we can. What we also have some questions that Olave has prepared prior to today before she fell ill, also in consultation with the 2 of you. So we'll just ping off each other and we'll see where we go. So thank you both for your contributions so far. I see questions. Let me start with a question from the audience, because I think that's just most fair, because they've been silent so far. And the first question is by Peter Jens: why not build on Article 13 of the Lisbon Treaty? Which talks about the 5 freedoms, and according to Peter, they could be translated to, with some creativity and wordsmithing, to relate to inanimate entities too. So maybe for everyone here, can you unpack the Lisbon Treaty and what this person is referring to, and then reply to their answer?
Okay. So the Lisbon Treaty is the main treaty of the European Union, sometimes regarded as the Constitution of the European Union. And Article 13 indeed is the article that refers to the sentience of animals.
So that's what you were talking about. That's like the relatively recent intervention, right? So for example, in Belgium, like the sentient beings.
Well, yeah, but this one dates before at the European level. So it is a very important article, and I certainly support and building further on it. But it's also a really welfare-based article that really states that it assumes that we can use animals for all kinds of purposes as long as we take into account their sentience. So it is also really legitimizing animal use, and it makes an important exception for religious rights. And so it is also often used in the opposite way, actually, that member states say, well, according to Article 13, we can make exceptions for religious rights, and then it forms kind of an obstacle. It can even feature as an obstacle for animal protection. So I would say it's an important article, certainly, and we should build upon this recognition of sentience. But I don't think it goes far enough yet.
And in what way then? Because you have your animal dignity as an alternative. So maybe can you explain?
Yeah, well, animal dignity is a more central idea that the animal should be relevant to law as intrinsically valuable being. So not only in terms of its use value to humans, but as intrinsically relevant and intrinsically valuable in itself. So it goes a step further. It's also broader, and the problem with these welfarist provisions is that the whole concept of welfare has become a bit, well, traditionally it was very much related to production animals, that the higher the production, the better the welfare. That was kind of the assumption. So I think the principle of animal dignity would build further on it, but also take animal protection one step beyond just merely noticing their welfare in that sense.
So in that sense, the Lisbon Treaty and Article 13 is just not far-reaching enough, in your view?
Yeah, I would say so.
Okay, thank you. All right. I'm looking at some of the questions that Olafur has prepared, and I think that one of the topics that I find very interesting relates to maybe what you've been talking about as well, Darko, as you talk about the rights of nature. I was not aware that there's a struggle in the Netherlands, where I'm also from personally, that there was a rights of nature struggle, which is very interesting. Could you maybe explain a bit how that idea of rights of nature and legal representation relates to conservationism and neocolonialism? Because I recall from your work that is something that you have combined in your previous research. And you also see some tensions there. So I'd like to hear a bit about that.
Yeah, I would like to say something about, in that case, about the assumption actually that there is a big struggle going on for rights of nature in the West. It is happening, yes, okay. There are struggles, of course, and there's a lot of movement, but and there's also a focus on that it's happening here. That's sort of the mainstream idea, that it's happening here. But I think there's a lot of...
Sorry, just to interrupt you.
Yeah.
You're saying that the mainstream idea about the rights of nature struggles that is happening here? Because I would say that the mainstream idea about the rights of nature struggles that is happening in settler colonies, such as throughout Latin America or in Australia, the right of nature debate, the way I see it, and the way I know that it has come to have some media attention, is about, the case in Ecuador with the river or the mountain in Australia. So yeah.
Well, okay. Yeah, then you're, I think, better informed than a lot of people I speak to. That's nice. But yeah, because I wanted to say that 80% of biodiversity in worldwide is protected on indigenous lands. I think that's an important big number, especially considering the fact that that indigenous peoples only are like 5% of the world population. I think last year was 2019, the year before last year, was the record number of climate activists being killed. I think it's around 212, something like that. And yeah, it's mostly almost everybody, all of them are killed in the global south, and 40% is indigenous, are from indigenous communities. And also, if you look at the rights of nature, indeed, those started in Ecuador, the first country that included the rights of nature into their constitution. Afterwards, you had Bolivia. That's well, neighboring country, very close. But the thing is that when I was doing research in Ecuador and Bolivia,
can you say which year we are?
Sorry?
When did you do the research? Which year?
I think it was 2018 that I was there. Yeah. And when I was there, so the discourse in Ecuador, to start with that one, rights of nature comes from the idea of buen vivir. Buen vivir, having a good life, translated to English. Buen vivir, Spanish, comes from the Quechua suma causai. The suma causai is an indigenous Quechua idea, or philosophy, better to say, which is very, very comprehensive. It's very broad, very wide, and it includes actually everything. But when I was doing research over there, and I was talking to many different indigenous actors, they were saying, okay, so this whole bubble idea of suma causai got interpreted and translated into this buen vivir idea, but it lost all its importance and its groundedness, so to speak, with what it really means. So it's lost in translation, so to speak, because even talking about nature, in Spanish, naturaleza, you are imposing dualisms by stating those words, for example, in indigenous contexts. Is that clear?
Yep, for me it is. If it's not for you at home, please.
Yeah.
type your thoughts in the
So
chat.
so when I was talking with Dario, for example, as one of the indigenous leaders I got to know there, he told me, okay, but you are talking about nature. And for me, that's such a small and strange concept, he said. You can't talk about nature. You are excluding the whole fact that the river has a spirit, the jaguar has a spirit, the forest has spirits. And talking about nature, yeah, it loses all its value. And yeah, well, that connects to this whole discourse that lives in Ecuador around rights of nature, buen vivir. It's all translated, and it's all yeah, losing its value along the way.
So if I understand, so from your critique on the rights of nature, or maybe if I understand your critique correctly, is about the limitation of that sort of way for emancipation, because in a way it's inevitably limited by the parameters of a colonial or a colonial heritage, which is the the heritage of the names and the words and
exactly,
and the legal systems that we have that are still predominant. So then if we go back to my question about conservationism, so for example, worked at wow, now I'm thinking about WWF. What does it stand for again? Worldwide.
World, what? Oh,
well,
God.
okay, type it in the chat as
we
well.
know
So WWF, we all know the organization.
Yeah.
So the work, for example, that they do, would you then categorically say like, this is not correct, this is imposing colonialism? Or do you see some alternatives? Because I'm also thinking here of, for example, animal politics that maybe you know a bit more about, is that, if we use different categories, different words, or are we staying with the ones that we have in the West, which is the distinction between animal and human? So I'm trying. I am seeing some common ground here, and I wonder what you think.
So the question is?
The question is.
Is the WWF colonial? Is that the question?
Well, okay, and answer it if the way you posted.
Well, no. Okay, but I think they're trying to do their best. To be really honest, I have a project in collaboration with some Chilean organizations and Mapuche Pehuenche organization, which is partly funded by the WWF. So I think I understand where they're coming from, what they're trying to do, but I also see how it's really it's just this really bureaucratic accountancy structure that is imposed every time, again and again, through NGOs and through these project plans. And each time, everything has to sort of fit into planning, finance, etc., language, and that is only the discursive impact. Then you also have what is funded. My funding project is really about how to, it's about using arts, indigenous knowledge, and collaboration. So that is sort of an innovative project which the WWF is funding. But there are also examples of people getting killed by the indirectly by the WWF, because the WWF is giving money to rangers to, well, I think the numbers are known about this.
What do you mean? So they militarize their places that they try to conserve,
Yeah.
the nature places then, and that also leads to human losses. Is that what you're saying?
Yes,
Okay.
torture, and of course a lot of examples of how indigenous peoples, but also non-indigenous, just people who are expelled from their countries, so they're thrown out because of conservation. And then you can ask yourself, is that that new form of conservation that is imposed then on the territory, is that the right way to do it? Because in the south of Chile, that's what this project is about that I'm doing there, you see that you have these big national parks, but that's the place where where people go to rob natural resources. Where that's the place where fires get started, and indigenous Mapuche people who have been living there before, who have been expelled because of these parks, say, well, if we were there, then it wouldn't have happened. So, yeah.
So you see the tension there.
There's a lot of tensions, yeah.
How does that relate to your work, or does it relate at all?
Yeah, I do see some parallels with what you were saying before, but maybe in a very different sense. But the whole practice of conservation uses also this process of labeling, in fact, of which species are to be protected, which species are to be killed, which often employs also this idea of native and non-native species. And well, ecosystems always change, of course. So it is humans that determine in the end, oh, this species should be saved and this species should be killed. So there's quite a problematic process there, kind of a biopolitical force almost, that decides about life and death. And in the end, it's mainly the charming species, the lion and the elephant that the West wants to see protected, that for which then those natural parks are created. So there's a lot of politics behind it, that in some cases is quite problematic, I would say.
Politics, and also, as if I take a lead from what Darko said, also value systems.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
That are still quite anthropocentric in the sense that they are often based upon like the charm of a species and do not really take into account the context of such environment and the indigenous peoples that might live also in this area and have a whole different view and different relationship with
Exactly.
the species.
Who determines who is valuable?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I see. Thank you. I see we have a comment on the WWF, World Wrestling Federation, which is this is a joke, or World Wildlife Fund.
Oh yeah,
That's it.
Yeah. So, well, Peter's very active, which I really enjoy. But I also like to invite everyone else to ask questions. So I'm scrolling a bit. So there's a question from Manon de Courten. Question on the rights of the dunes. Observing how the dunes and vegetation in the dunes evolve in The Hague, the Netherlands, the question arises, according to these rights, should we leave the vegetation grow on its own, or should we intervene, as it has been done massively in The Hague, by uprooting thousands of bushes so that dune grass can grow again and hold the dunes together? Connected questions. As for all rights, these have to be protected and promoted. What can be the role of humans in them? I think you can both answer to this, even though it's not necessarily your expertise.
Maybe start with the first about the dunes and the grass.
Please.
Marinus, the artist, he would say that, okay, dunes can have grass on them, but like the true pure form of a dune is a dune that can move freely. So the helmgras, the grass that is growing on the dunes, that's actually a forest that maintains the dunes together. So it sort of permits them to move freely around.
It's like a border on them, maybe, than
Well,
an actual border.
Yeah, well, the way that humans use this grass to maintain and restrict the dunes from moving is creating borders.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm.
Okay.
Yeah, I think this question touches upon a very core problem or issue, which is who decides what the rights are exactly of
Mm.
non-humans. And I already see that, like, among my fellow animal law people, that even with regard to dogs, for instance, very many people have very different ideas about what their rights would be.
Mm.
So you can see with the dunes, people might say, well, they should be without this grass, or they should be with this grass, or and it makes me also think of, for instance, the issue of the Oostvaardersplassen
Mhm.
that you guys might know as well, where
We know,
that
but
was
maybe
also
they don't know at home. So explain the issue of the Oostvaardersplassen, please.
yeah,
Really complex, I guess.
yeah, it's really complex.
I
but
mean, I mean, I
make-
have it also almost here about culling or killing. I would
Oh
say.
yeah,
But
exactly.
maybe,
That's a bit related. So this is the main natural park of the Netherlands, which is totally man-made. Humans have introduced the big animals there. So
what kind of animals are there?
there are deer and horses, for instance, big grazers, but also all kinds of birds. And a whole ecosystem has developed around it. And there have been several cases about it, like about 6, 7 cases. So I'm not going to reiterate all of them, but the central questions there were always, is the state not under a duty to take care, for instance, of the deer, that they don't die of starvation in the winter, for instance, because it is humans who have put them there. And it's really hard to find the right answers, because on the one hand, you could say, well, it's the individual animal who has a moral claim to us, who should be saved, whereas ecologists would say it's better for the ecosystem when the population is controlled and just naturally a part of it dies, for instance. So
And what would your principle of animal dignity? How would, if you look at through the lens of animal dignity, how would you?
that's a very good question. That's a very good question. And I think that's precisely the kind of questions I'm trying to answer in my research. But one important thing about animal dignity is that it is really about the ability to flourish of an animal, to become the fullest version of itself. So that should be stimulated. And I think, yeah, how that exactly plays out in a whole ecosystem, it's hard to tell now, but I think, for instance, with these animals that live a relatively wild life, there would not be necessarily a large degree of intervention by humans necessary in order to secure their flourishing. So I think then it would be mainly creating the facilities for these animals to live their free lives.
Which would always be limited, like the dunes, by human.
Yeah, always. Certainly in the Anthropocene.
Humans who make the frameworks of that.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, maybe that last question then is for both of you. As for all rights, these have to be protected and promoted. What can be the roles of humans in promoting and protecting rights? Rights of nature, animal rights? Or does this question does not speak to you at all?
Well,
Yeah,
yes.
it's just a hard question, I suppose.
Well, we're here for the tough conversation.
Yeah, for me right now in the current legal system, we will still need humans to be in courts to represent those who cannot speak for themselves. Like ideally, it would be a more direct link somehow between the non-human entity or animal and the political consequences. But how to establish that link, I think, is a very hard.
Well, when I think about the conversations I had with people in the Delta, and looking from the perspective of non-humans, like the dunes, you really get the feeling of how aggressive we are as a species, humans. The dunes just move. They move freely. The climate changes, they go with the flow. They will go and they will come back eventually. But humans, we put up borders. We think of solutions. We impose ourselves on natural processes. We create all kinds of technological structures. I sincerely think that rights is again more social structure that is imposed, which is necessary because we are so aggressive. If we wouldn't be so aggressive, if we would go to a different kind of or different way of being, a different way of relating to nature, to ourselves, to whatever, I think, yeah, maybe we would still need some kind of social structures like this. I'm not pleading for complete anarchy in that sense, but yeah, I think that's the at the core is that we are aggressive and we are protecting nature from ourselves, from us.
So it
We
would
could
be a
also-
strategic approach to law and legality, and there's also to the role of humans in promoting rights. Like not perfect, but strategic.
Yeah, it's a way to. I don't know if I understand you right, but yeah, it's a necessary evil because of our own evil, so to
Yeah,
speak.
then I was
Yeah.
saying the same. Yeah.
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 I think that interesting also what Manisha Dekker was saying last I want to say last week, but last part of this trilogy, when she said like indeed, you know, that sort of these legal frameworks are problematic, but at the same time there is this structural, extremely violent or extreme violence against animals that we just cannot afford not to engage with the law and not to engage with rights.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or we as human species maybe can, but if you care about animals, then
Yeah, and there's one important thing I think we always have to keep adding to this we is who is the we that we are talking about, because I'm also talking about we because it's really easy to fall into that. But I'm talking, we have to define the we, because the we I think is modern, urban, capitalist society, conditioned to be a certain type of consumer in a welfare system, etc. But that it's not being human that is essentially wrong or anything, because I think that's an important
it's
thing we
always
need.
important to situate to be. I definitely
Yeah.
agree with that.
But it's not happening enough, I guess.
Yeah.
That's my
I see you nodding. What do you think?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with this remark. And I think it's also one of the central issues with this whole concept of the Anthropocene, that it kind of assumes that the human species as such is responsible for something. Whereas in fact, if the anthropos there in Anthropocene is only a very particular part, group of humans that does not represent the whole species. So I think it's always important indeed to contextualize.
Who is then not represented in that, do you think, in your opinion? Like who should we look at as the main cause for Anthropocene? And if we talk about the Anthropocene, we talk about all humans are responsible for the depletion of the earth and its resources. But what kind of power structures are you hinting at?
Well, there are, for instance, alternative names for this this time, like the Capitalocene, which focuses more on the fact that it's not so much the human per se, but the capitalist structure that is in the end responsible for the way in which we deal with nature. And other...
Chittilocene.
The what?
Chittilocene.
Yeah, the Chittilocene.
From the
like
Haraway.
Yeah, yeah.
The plantation scene, the Plasticine.
Plantation
There are a lot of types of scenes.
Yeah, also the Anthroponautsene.
Oh, okay.
Which is really nice.
I think that is the point why I also don't use this term Anthropocene, because for the Anthropocene, as we discussed, focuses on one type of a specific type of being human. But I think all these terms are big generalizations again and again. So I think we should go to a more sort of grounded approach, which is multi-layered and focusing on socio-economic structures, environmental structures, and not fall too fast in these type of big conceptual. It can be strategic, it can be helpful, but then we need to really start talking.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I have two things. I want to look at the chat, and I have no clue what time it is. So if anyone can tell me, give me a signal when we hit last 5 minutes, and then when we're done, I would very much appreciate that. That was just for the behind the scene people. So I have another question by Peter Jens, but I also had one. I saw Herman. Oh, I'm gonna start with Herman Krul. They have 2 questions. The first one is very short. Should animals be in parliament? Second question is animals as a separate category in civil codes. What are the legal consequences of being in that category compared to lifeless objects?
Okay. Should I answer?
Yeah, I would assume that it's mainly to you.
Well, I would say animals need to be in parliament for sure, yes. And of course, in some countries, you have party of the animals, like in the Netherlands. And there's a growing number of parties of the animals throughout European countries. But
They now even formed a European alliance.
yeah, exactly. So I think
Interesting.
that's a really important development indeed. And with regard to the
But then is the question, are those animals in the parliament?
yeah, that's true. Then we get back to the same issue, like
Mhm.
can we actually represent them in such way by human actors? But again, I think within the limits of today's world,
Mm.
that's probably the only way that is open now.
Mhm.
Oh, I just want to break in there,
Mhm.
just because we were experimenting with ideas about this.
Who's the we here?
Sorry, yeah. I don't even know if I mentioned their names before, but the research I'm doing in the Delta is together with Teun Karels and Maarten Kleinhans. Teun Karels is an artist also, and Maarten Kleinhans is a geologist. Teun experimented with the idea to put up a microphone at the parliament and export. How do you say that?
Export?
Yeah,
I'm not sure what you want to say, so continue.
No, the sound of the parliament and let the dolphins hear what people are saying, and the other way around. So putting really like the sounds of the Harbor Porpoise into parliament, or perhaps throw in a dune into the parliament, or a big bowl of seawater. And these are ideas that are based on the fact that, okay, we like being there can also impact the situation, the way.
Sort of embodied knowledge instead of sort of the rational talk then in the parliament.
Yeah, because you smell it, you feel it, you hear it. There are different types of ways of getting information. And this is pure experimental, but it can be interesting to put animals inside of the parliament.
Yeah, it's nice. It's a nice idea. It's really a Laturian parliament of things that we're creating.
Yeah.
It's nice. But the other question?
Yeah. Animals as a separate category in civil codes. What are the legal consequences of being in that category compared to lifeless objects?
Well, that's a good question because there are hardly any consequences. It's largely a very symbolic change. So it is happening, and I think it is important to note and to see and to take into account. But we should remain critical of it because it just, in most cases, like I was saying in the beginning, it just states animals are not things. The provisions applying to things apply to animals. So yeah, not a lot changes. What is positive is, I think, that it makes the animal visible at least, and therefore also in case law. I see more and more cases in private law, for instance, in divorce cases, where judges are more willing to actually see the animal and discuss its interest, take its interest into account. Because now there's actually also a legal basis that states animals are not things. So that used to be very different because in Pennsylvania, there was this famous case in which a judge said, well, you cannot have a visiting arrangement with an animal because that would be like having a visiting arrangement with a lamp or a table. For law, they are equal. So this new category at least makes it clear that they are not equal.
So there's because there's also this builds on some questions that I had while I was listening to your talk, because I wonder, so it makes a difference, but what is the status still? Are animals in that sense still property?
Yes, exactly. They're still property. They're still ownable. So
so then what are interests of animals?
Well, that's, for instance, in divorce cases where the question is who has the strongest property claim to this animal. That happens quite often. Then when there's a divorce, that there is a conflict, just as there's with kids, of course.
Like you can exchange the CDs, but the
Yeah,
values, but you
exactly.
cannot divide the
Yeah.
one dog or the one cat.
No, and then now you see more often judges saying, well, in the interest of the animal would be to be with that parent, for instance. So in Switzerland, this has also been literally codified in the civil code that judges should take into account the interest of the animal, the welfare, the best welfare requirements that someone can offer. But you see more often that judges are willing to see it more as a kind of a multi-species family almost, that an animal is more like a member of a family.
And this makes me really think, because I personally also have a background and an interest in queerness, queer theory, queer politics, and there's also a lot of well, in general, in sort of thinking queer and in queer politics, this idea of kinship, like your family is beyond sort of the heteronormative and monogamy model, right? And there's also people who are maybe share a child and are three parents, or there's maybe a child that lives within two sort of more typical traditional family units. And it also talks about sort of this idea to sort of open up this idea of the household, which is in this sense interesting, that it can also include not only human species then, but multi-species. And there's a lot of work around thinking queerness and animality and animal politics. So this is another point of conversion. Yeah.
Yes,
that's cool.
I think that's really related.
Yeah, that's cool. Okay, I'm looking at the chat again and again. I want to incite everyone to talk. We have here a question from Christian Muller. Anthropocene has a physical science based. It relates from stratigraphy. A radioactive layer is the proof of human intervention. Dunes and rivers are not living. You seem to extend animal rights to them. All right, so maybe this is more of a comment, but this then goes into should and can and are there any differences in terms of entities between natural formations versus non-human animals? And would that make a difference for legal strategies?
Can you repeat the comment?
Comment?
Yeah, I didn't.
Anthropocene has a physical science basis. It relates from stratigraphy, which point between brackets, a radioactive layer is the proof of human intervention, end of brackets. Dunes and rivers are not living. You seem to extend animal rights to them.
Okay, dunes are not living, and the other one was dunes and?
Dunes and rivers.
Rivers.
So maybe you can talk a bit about the case in Ecuador, maybe, because I think that's and the sort of indigenous idea of spirits.
Yes, I think this comment. I think of course it's completely correct in scientific terms. But when looking at it from, for example, indeed, indigenous perspective from Ecuador or whatever, you could say that this is a very narrow approach to, for example, the dunes and the river and the sea, and that they are living entities. I think I don't know of indigenous groups that have this bond with the dunes, not yet, as far as my knowledge goes. But I do know of indigenous groups who have that with rivers. For example, in New Zealand, this Wanganui River, who has the rights of personhood. So yeah, there's an argument to make for that it is a living being. Yes, and Anthropocene, yeah. I think indeed, yeah, from a geological perspective, of course, you can say it's there. But then again, you don't have this definition of what is then the human. There's missing a social component in this whole discourse about Anthropocene. Yes, from a geological perspective, okay, but the world is not only geography.
Yeah, I think also indeed for this comment sort of illustrates what we've been talking about in terms of power structures, right? So how do we value Western knowledge systems, in this case, physical science, in relation to other ways of thinking about the world. What is the world? How do we relate to the world? Which in very philosophical terms, we talk about ontologies. There is different ontologies, or maybe in indigenous words, cosmovisions, that think about the world differently than we do in Western ways. And in that sense, indeed, dunes, rivers, or formations have a certain spiritual, or not a certain, they have spiritual value and are living entities, would maybe already be our world, but are have a living essence and a value, therefore, that we in Western knowledge science cannot even label. And that's again then points to the problem with labeling and protecting, etc. Right?
Yeah, I think also in the biological philosophy, there's some, I don't know how recent it is, but there's increasing study on the, on life as processes. So there's a philosophical shift from seeing the world in things, but seeing everything as process. When you look at the human body, for example, you can say, okay, this is a human point, but actually the human consists to a large extent of bacteria, microbes. We don't even determine our own behavior to a large extent because our gut does that. And that's microbes and bacteria that do that. So I think there's a case also to also in Western scientific terms, there's a case to make for that this is way more complex.
Yeah, definitely. Do you? I see you a lot of nodding from you.
Oh yeah,
Do you have any thoughts to share?
I just agree very much, and it makes me think of like the bigger picture of Gaia, of seeing the whole world as one
Gaia.
organism.
Gaia.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah. I thought you spoke about the animal rights group here, but no.
Oh yeah.
No. Gaia is in the world.
Yeah.
Continue. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I meant that's a bit the same way in which there's this tendency to look more at the organism, how everything is a process, and as also the world in itself is one living organism in a sense.
I am listening, but I'm also looking at the question. So somehow I saw some others. Okay, there's a big comment. Oh no, wait, Michelle. Thank you for your presentations. Do you think it's conceivable that humans would equalize their rights with other humans, for example, on dignity? And then he says, other than humans, sorry. Okay, so do you think it's conceivable that humans would equalize their rights with other than humans, for example, on dignity?
Equalize probably in the sense of like making them as important, equally important.
Yeah, maybe in that, yeah, I would say, yeah.
Probably. Well, not in the near future, probably, but you do see clearly that the standard is moving. Many practices that were considered totally legitimate, like using animals for all kinds of entertainment purposes, are of course more and more prohibited. So I think we are getting closer to such situation, but it's still very far away. I think the day on which animal rights will be evenly weighed against human rights is still quite far away.
Makes me also think again of again part one of this trilogy with Manisha Dacca, who spoke about one of the she has many reasons why she theorizes the legal category of beingness in as an alternative to the category of legal personhood. Many sort of conceptual reasons, but also that we've spoken about a bit already, but also the strategic reason of the fact that it's likely that there will be so much resistance, and it's already shown by humans to have animals being included in the same category, that she says it's just like it's not very realistic that we will ever arrive at that. So maybe if we find a new category that gives the same type of protection but doesn't say humans and animals are the same, it's maybe more likely that we'll at some point in the future greater protection.
Yeah, I also absolutely agree with the pragmatic point. Also, because you see that there's still very much this connection of personhood with also accountability and liability, and that especially just lawyers are very hesitant to include beings that we cannot hold responsible for their action. For
Mm.
instance, in the idea of personhood. And indeed, often people who want animals to be legal persons assume that that will also be the end of all the animal production industries that we see today.
Yeah.
So I think that will be actually a long transitional process, and that will not
Mm.
happen on one day that we decide animals are persons now.
Yeah.
So I also am very much in favor of like this kind of legal beingness
Mm.
constructs.
It's sort of, yeah. So, Anonymous attendee says, the we question is always important in the climate debate too, but also, for instance, now with COVID-19. We see many people referring to humans and the relationship with the environment / non-human animals as the problem, while the roots are, of course, of a particular set of capitalist practices, etc. Well, I think that is a very great comment. That was what we talk about. Do you want anyone of you wants to build on that, or?
Yeah, I agree, and I also want to mention that I do see it also as a potential to connect it more. The idea that animal health and environmental health have very much to do also with human health. This is a bit the idea of one health or one welfare, that those three are just intrinsically connected. You cannot just focus on human health because then we'll end up in this kind of pandemics. So in that sense, this pandemic could be a potential to put the attention on that. They are all interconnected. We have to take care of all of these three aspects. I think you have to add.
I don't really have anything to add to that one. I think maybe just one thing that I'm thinking of. I'm just a little bit scared to go into a COVID direction because of all different ideas and discussions. But I think it is interesting to look at the way we or our governments are dealing with it. Is really rationally approaching humans as rational beings, expecting them to make rational choices, and I think it's a very nice example of how emotional and how emotional beings we are as humans. Everybody's those rules, yes, but not apply.
And how do you relate that to your critique on Western knowledge?
Now, well, the approach or the assumption in Western knowledge science is that we are the Homo economicus, the rational being above nature. We think and we act really rational, right? But I think this goes to show that that's absolutely not the case.
I have here a question by Brunilda Pali. Instead of keep extending legal rights laws, an approach which is largely bound to remain symbolic, isn't it better to think of introducing strong politics and mechanisms to create limits to domination, to harm, to profit, to interference, which would benefit all the categories we are trying to embrace, including ourselves?
Yeah, I think that's a good comment. And it could be a way. I wouldn't say giving everything right is the best option. I think this is a really valid addition.
Couldn't you maybe, if you agree, also think of examples, because that will come from you, okay? Yes, so we should create strong politics and mechanisms to limit harm and domination. Maybe Brunilda can also write down, do you have any examples in mind? And do you have any examples in mind thereof? Like, given the status quo of today, what would be the first strong political acts that we can do that would pose such a limit to domination?
I feel it's a really political question and not so much a legal one. But
well, okay, this is an interesting case because law is always, I guess, in a way also political.
Absolutely, that's true. That's true.
But from a legal perspective, what would you think?
Well, from a legal perspective, I would say there are various important steps we could take, such as making our constitutions include animals and environmental rights would already be a good start. That it's not necessarily about rights, because that's what she means.
So it means, I guess,
not in the rights way, right?
exactly something like, yeah, we can continue to extend legal rights. So dream up new legal categories such as beingness, dream up new
Yeah.
principles such as animal dignity. But maybe with what we have already, can we just not create some sort of, well, he calls it strong politics and mechanisms, but I would say maybe a sort of translate that to a policy intervention, right?
Mm.
So what would we have? What can we do with what we already have?
Yeah, well, I think then an important thing is to have adequate and good representation of all these different stakeholders, and not
Mm.
only humans.
Mm.
So we have in parliament,
yeah.
in the political structure,
Mm.
so that at least all these different stakeholders have a voice.
Mm.
in a sense.
Of course, then you have the question: is representation enough?
Again, we get back to
Circle
core.
conversations. All right. So I have here by Peter Jens a long comment, I think, and maybe question. I will read it out loud. Nice presentation on the dunes. Time scale is important, and there are no things alive or dead. There are only processes and patterns, and time is the medium. Secondly, I'm involved in genetics, and there is a budding novel concept called biological relativity, based on circular causality, demonstrating that everything and every being is constantly connected to each other and on a long time scale is morphed into each other. Any boundary is temporarily and arbitrary. Basically, biological relativity could be used to argue that if humans are sovereign now, non-humans are too, and inanimate entities ought to be seen as sovereign too on the longer time scale. We, humankind, have the handicap of thought and reason, hence the burden is on us to allow non-humans and apparent inanimate objects their sovereignty and be their guardians. And guardians is a trigger for me.
Yeah,
We have not talked about that a lot, but it's something that has been written down by Olaf. But maybe in general, you can talk about, if you want to respond to this comment, then also maybe introduce the idea of guardianship.
I just want to say that I would like to have a talk with him or her. I don't know.
Peter Jens, yeah, we don't
Peter
know.
Jens. Okay, yeah, sounds really interesting. His approach from his genetics, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. It kind of provides almost a biological genetic base for the idea of one health, one welfare, that everything's interlinked in that sense. And guardianship was then the second question.
Yeah, well, I've seen here there's a debate on ownership versus guardianship. And you've talked about that in preparation with Olaf, I assume. Yeah. So maybe you can talk about, if you'd like, introduce us to the debates between these concepts.
Who you?
Okay. Well, within animal law, there are different ways in which this debate takes place. There are many animal organizations who just want to kind of substitute the term ownership with guardianship, because it would better represent the kind of relation that exists between a human and their animal. But also in a more legal way, a legal guardian is usually someone who takes legal decisions for the ward of which takes care. But in essence, I think there's
still this hierarchy, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it is often presented as a very different concept, but I don't think it is actually that contrary to each other, because it's kind of built up on the same structure. And ownership over animals in today's world is not a total dominion, because you have also duty of care towards your animal. You cannot just do with it with whatever you want to. So I think these terms are less contrary than is often assumed. It's more important to de-instrumentalize the relationship, I think. And whether you call it ownership or guardianship, to me, does not seem as the most important question. But I know that there's also this river in New Zealand. There's also the concept of guardianship, which is more in the way that there are certain people that speak for the river, that kind of take the legal decisions for the river. So there it functions in a kind of a somewhat different way.
Yeah, I think this is the Maori people, but yeah, I think also in indigenous context, this idea of guardianship is different, but maybe that is also a term, a thing of translation. But I think I fully agree with you. What you say is that it's. I see them as you still put it outside of yourself, and there's still this hierarchy. So
Mm.
in both of the cases,
Yeah, and you still deny the agency in a sense of the object.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. I've seen that it's time, or a while back it was 5 minutes, so I'm assuming now it's time. Thank you so much, Darko and Eva, for sharing your thoughts, and thank you as well. I now want to look at my iPad, but I should look at there first. Thank you so much at home for sharing your thoughts and your comments. If anyone wants to get in touch with you, I'm sure you can find them both online. I found you on Twitter. I found you on the website of the University of Antwerp. So Peter, Jens, please get in touch to continue the conversation. No, but really, thank you so much. I'd also like to thank everyone here behind the scene, because it's been such a change to work in this COVID-19 time. So thank you everyone here, all the technical people and all the support staff. Especially thank you Crosstalks, VUB, Goedele and Barbara from the Kai Theater. And thank you Olava, Nwanje. Thank you so much for organizing and hosting, and we're still very sorry that you're not here, but we hope to see you soon at one of our events, which will be, because there is going to be quite some follow-up. Tomorrow, there's the final part of this trilogy, which is an online workshop thinking about and working with the campus of Etterbeek, which is one of the campuses of the Vrije Universiteit here in Brussels, to think about it as a ZOAP. Then, as part of the larger More Than Human Encounters series, there are 2 events scheduled in March. The first one is on the 2nd of March, which is called Cripping Animal Ethics and Activism, which talks about disability and animality. And the second event is going to be in March 25, which is to highlight the International Day Against Racism, which will be about race, species, and becoming human, and will feature Zakiya Iman Jackson, who has written a book called Becoming Human, Matter and Meaning in an Anti-Black World, which will also be a lot about process ontology that we have sort of discussed today. Yeah, so you're very much welcome to join then. We hope you tune in, and you can find all the details and reserve your tickets through the website of Kai. And of course, we welcome everyone here. So if you do not have the financial means, you're always welcome to reserve a free ticket. But if you do have any, we would like to ask you for some donation, because everything, unfortunately, costs money. So thank you so much, and we'll see you soon. Yay.